Hello and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast by Opus Partners. I'm your host, Stephen Knight.
I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today's show, we're talking about the hidden costs when you buy a property and when you actually pay the money. And I wanted to talk about this because people will often say to me, okay, Ed, be honest. If I go and buy a property, like obviously I'm going to pay the money for the house, but what are all of the other bills that I'm going to get? Because people hate getting unexpected bills. Why are you laughing at
Just
that?
the way you said it. You're very animated today.
They
You had too much
hate
coffee.
it. No. Well, here's the thing. People do hate it when you get unexpected bills. So this is going to be your ultimate guide to all of the costs that you might face when you buy a property. Now, we're specifically going to talk about a new build property today because there are a couple of other quirks, but this will also apply pretty much for anybody purchasing an existing property as well. And so by the end of it, you'll know the costs that you're going to face and when you actually pay that money. Now, Andrew, there are typically 3 stages when you buy an investment property. What are they?
Okay, so you've got your due diligence phase. So this is when you sign up to buy a property, but you haven't gone unconditional yet. Then you've got your pre-settlement, so the time from when you've gone unconditional to settlement. And then you've got the actual settlement of the property when you're buying it, when it actually changes hands.
And there are lots of different costs that you are going to face. So for instance, with due diligence, you are going to pay some setup costs and you're also going to pay typically about a 10% deposit. Now, how do you get into due diligence? What does that take? Well, that's when you sign a contract or you make an offer on a property and that offer is accepted. At that stage, it is conditional. So it might go ahead, but you might also have the option to pull out. So it's not unconditional. And remember, unconditional is where you're fully committed to buying that property. So if you're in that DD stage and you do end up paying for that property, what are you going to pay for? Well, the first thing is you're probably going to pay for a valuation. Almost 100% of the time, you're probably going to pay for that valuation. That's going to cost somewhere between $800 to $1,200. And the way that works is your mortgage broker sends you a link from the bank. It's either going to be from CoreLogic or Velocity. You pop in your credit card details and you pay them $800 to $1,200, whatever it happens to cost. On top of that, you may have some travel costs. So let's say that you live in Invercargill and you're buying in Nelson, or you live in Nelson and you're buying in Auckland. You might want to go to fly up to Auckland or down to Nelson, whatever it happens to be, and actually go and see that property. Even if it's a new build that hasn't been built yet, you might want to go and meet the developer, look at the site. Well, if you decide not to do that, it's not going to cost you anything. Or if you live in Nelson and you're buying in Nelson, it's not going to cost you much, maybe $5 for some petrol, some gas to get there. But on the high end, if you and your partner are going to fly to a different city and you're going to spend the night, it could cost you up to $1,000. And again, you're going to call up Jetstar. Well, nobody calls up these days. You're going to go on Air New Zealand's website, pop your credit card details in and pay you $1,000 then. But there could also be some lawyer fees and due diligence, even if you go ahead and purchase the property. Now, why is that a bit surprising, Andrew?
So sometimes lawyers will want to recoup some of their initial costs, particularly if you are buying off plans and the settlement's not for, say, 12 months away or 18 months away. They might want to cover some of their costs now. So while your total bill to buy a property might be $2,500, let's say, they might charge you $300 upfront in some instances, not all.
Yeah, the reason we're pointing this out is typically you pay your lawyer at settlement. Now, if you're buying an existing property that's already built, you go talk to your lawyer, you rack up some fees, and then once you get to settlement and you actually pay for the property, that's when you pay the lawyer. But if you're buying a new build, there might be a small upfront cost. But that shows you that due diligence can cost anywhere from $800 all the way up to $2,500 on the higher end. Most people are going to be around that $1,100 at this phase of DD. And of course, Andrew, at that point, you're also going to pay your 10% deposit.
Yeah, so if you get to the end of due diligence and say, hey, this is great, we're buying this investment property or we're buying this property, that's when you're going to pay a deposit. So let's say you're buying a $600,000 property. Normally it's 10% that you pay. Often people will borrow that if they're buying an investment property. So if you own your own house at the moment, you're borrowing the $60,000 against your house. That money's going to change hands, but of course there might be some interest over the next 12 months if you're under construction as well.
Okay, so that's the due diligence phase. Let's talk about what happens pre-settlement. So if it's a new build, it's why your property is being built. If it's an existing property, this might only be a 4-week period.
So when you get to settlement and you need to sign off that the property is fit for purpose for the tenants, two of the things that people often don't think about is healthy homes test and also a smoke detector test. So a healthy homes might cost you between $200 and $300. A smoke detector test to show that they're all functional would be about $100. Some people elect to get a meth test, so that's when they're going to go around and check that the property has had no meth use in it. Now you might be thinking, it's brand new. How will there be meth use in there? Well, actually, there were a lot of instances a number of years ago, about 8 years ago, when the property market was booming, particularly in Tauranga. I remember this was an issue. People who were working on the house were actually using the houses to smoke meth in, and remember, someone might have broken in and smoked meth there. So often, if you are going to do meth tests, you want to do that at the start. You want to have that baseline test.
Well, you need the baseline. If you're going to test later on and you want to check whether your tenant had smoked meth or not, you need the baseline test.
Yeah. The other thing is you might need some extra keys. So normally you would have 3 sets of keys that you would give to your property manager. And if you're managing it yourself, you still want to have those extra keys in case your tenant locks himself out. So it might cost you $10 a key kind of thing, depending if you've got some of those electronic fobs or maybe an electronic system, it might cost you a bit more, so maybe towards $150. Now here's one that even tricked me, bins. So if you're buying in Auckland, for example, you have to actually go and get the rubbish bins from the council. You have to pay for that. So that costs $250.
Now, if you're buying an existing property, it's already got to have bins, right? Or it should have bins. But if you're buying a new build, you've got to pay for them in Auckland. Cost you $250. If you're buying in Christchurch or Selwyn district or other parts of the country, it might not cost you anything because it's just included in your development contributions. When you buy the property, it just comes with the bins. But that's not the case everywhere in the country, and you've got to be aware of that, because otherwise you might come to settle this property and you might think, oh, nobody told me that I had to spend $250 to buy some rubbish bins.
Now, one of the other things that often people don't think about is gardening or lawnmower, because if you have some lawn and you've got a vacant time between when you settle and when the property's rented out, or even when code of compliance comes out and settlement, you want to make sure that those lawns are looking really, really nice, so that when a tenant comes to have a look at it, they think, oh, this is really nice. You don't want that to be all overgrown so that then the tenants don't look after it going forward. So that might cost you $150. And then we've put extra chattels in here of, say, $1,600 for if you need things like some whiteware. So say, for example, you've got your kitchen on the first floor of a townhouse. Well, you probably don't want tenants lugging a fridge up there every time they enter the property and then exit the property for their tenancy. So you might want to actually put those whiteware appliances in.
Yes, that's probably your washing machine and your fridge are the main thing. So like I've got an apartment that's on the 4th floor of a building, and there's no elevator in that building, right? Just stairs. So if tenants want to move in, they've got to lug a fridge 4 flights up. Don't look surprised. You sold me that property.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were talking about the one you lived in. Right.
No, the one that I own. And so if my tenants move out, that one actually doesn't have a fridge in it. But if my tenants ever moved out, I would definitely buy a fridge, because who wants to lug something up 4 flights of stairs? So your property management costs in pre-settlement, and this is just one of the costs, can be anywhere from $210 on the cheap side. But if you're going to go ahead and buy the whiteware, that really pushes up the cost to, almost $3,000. On average, it should only be around $660. But that is not the only pre-settlement cost. What else have we got, Andrew?
So in terms of property management, when you get your property listed, you want to pay some advertising fees, usually to Trade Me or something like that. You need to get a chattel valuation, so you can depreciate your chattels over time. So that's normally about $500.
With the Trade Me advertising, though, do they take it out of your rent or do you pay it to them?
You normally pay it up front, but some property managers might pay it out of the rent.
Yeah, okay. But what's the value of the chattel valuation?
About $500 to get that done through Valuer, who we recommend. They're a nationwide company and are excellent. Now, one of the other things where it can vary quite a bit from either $0 to kind of $2,500 is the entity setup. So if you're going to buy in your own name, there's no entity setup. If you're going to buy in, say, a company, it might cost you about $1,000 to set up. If you're going to set up a trust to own your properties and you haven't done that already, it might cost you $2,500 kind of thing.
But if you already have a trust set up, or you've already got the look-through company set up, it's not going to cost you anything extra. So sometimes there are those large but one-off costs, like your whiteware's $1,600. If you want to set up a trust, it can be $2,500. Those are the things that can really start to push the cost of buying a property up.
Now, one of the things that, again, people don't necessarily know about up front is a completion certificate from the valuer. Now, your valuer becomes the eyes and ears for the bank. So at the start, they might value the property off plans, but at the end, they sign off that that property has been built to the specifications that they valued on the basis of. So this isn't a new valuation. So if you get that report back and it says the same price as what you paid for it 12 months ago, that's not a new valuation. They're not comparing the market anymore. They're just saying, yes, we validate that valuation because now it's complete.
Now, that's really important to get because it can save you tens of thousands of dollars and take away a lot of risk. So the reason you get your property valued up front and then get a completion certificate later is so that if your property falls in value, the bank's now no longer saying, well, you need to put in more deposit because the property's fallen in value. They're going to use the original valuation. So if you do it that way, it costs you an extra $400, but it takes out so much risk.
It's a great insurance policy. And the final one is a building inspector. And again, this can range from sort of $700 to $1,000. And you might be thinking, I've just got a brand new property. I've had code of compliance. I don't need one. Some people elect not to do this, but we'd always recommend doing it because I've just had an instance again where a building inspector has found a leak in a property because the shower trap hasn't been attached. Remember, we've spoken about this before, and that could cause significant damage to the property had it not been picked up.
And so if you add it all up, pre-settlement costs could range from $1,800 all the way up to $7,000. Would probably recommend a lag for 2.2 to 3.2K. It all depends on whether you're going to pay to get a company set up or not. But it starts to add up, doesn't it? And we haven't even factored in construction interest. So if you're borrowing that deposit that Andrew talked about before, that $60,000 that you're paying your developer at a 7% interest rate, that's going to be about $80 a week or $4,200 a year every year while the property is being built. Now, of course, you might still get some capital growth. The value of the property might go up while the property is being built, but you've still got to factor in that cost. And so far, if you add it all up, you've spent about $1,100 on due diligence. You might have spent $3,200 on pre-settlement. You're about 4.3K deep. And then we've still got to factor in some settlement costs as well.
So then you've got your lawyer to actually complete the conveyancing. And again, this can range anywhere between $2,000 and $2,500. Rates and insurance. Now, this can be one that gets people. When you buy a property, if there's some rates that's been paid from the developer or the existing owner, then you have to compensate them for the time that they're not going to own that property if they paid it up front. Plus, sometimes people will pay their insurance up front as well. So you might allow $1,800 for that.
Yeah, so if I just give you an example, I bought a townhouse not too long ago, and I think if you include the rates and also the residents association, you pay that up front for a year, then that added up to $1,800. Now that just comes on your settlement statement when you get it from your lawyer about how much money you're going to transfer to your lawyer. But that's one thing that's really, really easy to overlook. And then, of course, we've got the cost of your lawyer, which might range from $2,000 to $2,500. To be honest, it could even be higher if you're using a really expensive lawyer.
Or if you've got a really sophisticated ownership structure. So sometimes some of my bills can be more expensive than that.
Yeah, so it can go up even further, but somewhere between 3.8 to 4.3K is what it might cost once you get to settlement. And Andrew, some people will be thinking, well, if you add up all of those costs, the setup cost to buy a property, and that's just to buy it, the transaction costs, it could be somewhere between 7 to 10 grand, maybe a little bit cheaper, maybe a little bit more expensive. How am I going to afford that? That is a lot of money to buy a house.
So often people will get a cashback if they're using one of the main banks and they're a regular applicant, so they're not borrowing really high LVR, which might exclude them from getting a cashback. There will often be an amount that the bank will give you towards your purchase cost. So that could be anywhere from $5,000 to maybe $10,000 in some instances that I've seen. But again, this is a conversation you have with your mortgage broker, and I know banks are tightening up on the amount that they're giving to cashbacks. One of the things that I often do, or often encourage people to do, is set up a revolving credit facility. If you've got equity in other properties, have a revolving credit facility, which can be really useful for unexpected bills. This could be a good time to use it. And then when you get your cash back from the bank, you can put that money back in there, or you can just pay that back over a period of a number of years.
Yeah, it's really important to remember that with that bank cashback, you might get somewhere between $3,000 and $7,000, for example, but that money doesn't happen until you've settled the property, right? So you've got to pay your lawyer before you get that cashback. So you do need to have credit or money, cash available to pay all of those costs. You might get it back through some bank contribution, but you've got to have the money first, and that's the key point. That's why you might use a revolving credit.
Yeah, and I know another thing people do is often they might put their whiteware on their credit card or something like that. Remember to always keep your receipts for those kind of things, because if you're not putting them out of your rental account, your accountant might miss them when it comes time to file your return.
Yeah, and that's why we've been very clear about what you can put on your credit card and what you really can't. And the last thing we haven't talked about is, of course, at settlement, you also pay the rest of your money. So if you've already paid 10% up front, you're going to pay the other 90% at the end, and then you officially own this property. But the really interesting thing about this exercise, Andrew, is does it surprise you how many costs there can be once you start thinking about all of the ones that might come up?
Well, I've done this a few times, and there were some costs in there that I hadn't even considered, so yes.
Yeah, and so the main thing here, I don't want to scare you off to say, if you buy a property, it's going to cost you an extra $8,000 in setup costs, but I do want you to be aware about what costs could be in there, and after watching this, you'll be able to think, okay, which ones, won't apply to me? Maybe setting up a trust won't apply to you. Maybe setting up a company won't apply to you. Maybe you don't need to buy a fridge and whiteware. Well, you might have just saved yourself $3,000 or $4,000 once you start taking those costs out. So it just gives you that great understanding about what you might have to pay, what you might be able to get away without.
Yeah, and I think if you own this property for 20 years, you're probably not going to be that worried about the $10,000 you paid to set it up when you're 20 years down the track.
Right, let's wrap it up there, but please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Really does help us get the message out to more people. And hey, if you're listening to this on your podcast app, you want to see some of the tables we're sharing, just Google Opus Partners YouTube. It'll be the first thing that comes up. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button. We release new videos every Monday and Wednesday. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Tim at Night.
I'm Andrew Nicol.
We're going to be back here tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.